We'll see how it goes. So, yeah. Yeah. Are you gonna stay up until to see the East Coast? No.
No,
You have no idea what time it is, do you?
Yeah, I mean more or less, but I think my watching is not going to affect the results.
No.
Do you know what I mean?
I wish I could.
Yeah, I wish we could do that.
But that's so true. But somehow I can't get myself to believe that. That's so true, though. Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, Obama would be saying, "Don't boo. Make sure to watch the election coverage."
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I just still remember going to sleep with Gore and waking up and having Bush president.
Sure.
And ever since then, I've been like paranoid about the election results.
I'm very pessimistic after waking up to Brexit.
Brexit.
Yeah, it's very
Have
similar.
that again.
Oh God, no.
And that's actually the one thing that's making me not want to stay up for Florida. Because if I see like Florida go one way, but then the other swing states end up going a different way, I can go to sleep thinking one thing.
Yeah.
Like the Gore was literally, he was like, they called it for him, and then 5 hours later, when I woke up.
Florida is the wrong way, then how are you going to sleep then? Big fool.
That's true. Maybe I just don't watch it. That's exactly it.
Yeah, so I guess we should make a start. Yep.
How
So
long should I go for, by the way?
you've got about 40 minutes,
All right.
45 minutes. So we've
All right.
got plenty of time
Okay. All right.
for discussion.
Just wanted to make sure. Sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm very happy to introduce Eric L. Sue from the Hawke Institute at the University of South Australia. He's just published The Consequences of Global Disasters with Anthony Elliott. And he's organizing a conference on the mobile cultures of disaster, which is a collaboration between the Hawke Institute and Rikyo University, the School of Sociology at Kwasi Gwakin University and Tokyo University. That's in March next year.
That's right.
Very excited about that. And apart from researching disasters, he is very interested in sleep and the sociology of acceleration and automation. But I'll let you explain that later
Sure.
on. So you've got about 40, 45
All right.
minutes, and then we've got plenty of time for discussion.
All right. Well, thank you very much. At the outset, I just need to thank a few people for making my visit possible. First of all, I should need to thank Monica for her support for my visit here. I should also just say thanks to Penny, even though she's not here this week, and obviously to Stephanie, who welcomed me yesterday. And then I need to acknowledge funding from the European Union. I feel like I'm getting in just as things are shutting down, but my visit has been funded by them, and I'm very grateful for their support. Okay, so I think the way I'll begin my presentation is actually by first by acknowledging that I'm actually quite new to the field of disasters research. I feel quite new to this space, and I wouldn't consider myself a deep expert in any way. I came to the topic a little bit by accident. A couple years ago, the Japan Foundation approached Anthony and I at the University of South Australia to see if we'd be interested in doing something about the Japan triple disaster on 3/11. We said yes, and that got us going with disaster research. But as I said, I know there's a number of experts here that do research in that field. Some of my remarks will be more, I guess, preliminary, or they will be a lot more speculative. And obviously I'm interested to hear your thoughts. What I'm going to try to do in today's presentation is actually look at disaster definitions, because I think this is quite important. I'm going to first sketch out why this question, why the disaster has been so important in the field of sociology. I'm then going to move to look at how I think there's been a tendency to define disasters in very temporally restricted ways, and then I'll move on to talking about how they've perhaps also been conceptualized in more spatially ones as well. And then I'm going to try to argue for a more expanded understanding of disasters. And then the broader ramifications of those are also something that I'll be covering. Okay, now I know of no other field than in sociology of disasters that has asked the question of what is its core area of study than the one I just further mentioned. Within the field, you see numerous volumes of books beginning with the title, What is a Disaster? It's interesting, actually, that you don't see this necessarily in other subdisciplines. So if you take the new mobilities paradigm, you don't see year after year articles asking, well, what are mobilities? What is a mobility? But that's not but that's not true then of in the field of sociology of disasters. Now, as Ronald Perry actually argues, this is not necessarily, though, such a bad thing in other fields. I mean, you don't have to establish consensus about a key idea for a field to flourish. And of course, cultural anthropology, he gives the example, is a pretty good example of this. Cultural anthropologists typically don't have a well-defined and specific understanding of culture, and yet this is a field that continues to flourish. And you can argue that maybe sociology is like this as well. Some people have, vastly different understandings of the concept of society and the social, and obviously the late and great John Urry had a lot to say about this as well, about whether or not sociology can be beyond societies. But nevertheless, it does do a number of things, though, when we start asking, well, what is the core area of study that we're studying? So when we're asking what is a disaster, that can either help to spur new lines of research, and I think actually definitional debates around mobilities has exhibited this quality as well. So if you think about Mimi Shallow clarification that doing mobilities research isn't just simply saying that people are moving more, people, ideas, and objects are moving more. That's not simply what mobilities research is about. Rather, it's just looking at that movement is involved with various processes. I think that was a very interesting clarification, and that spurred people to do a lot of different types of research. But within disasters, I think it can both spur new lines of research, but it can also clarify existing research that's out there. It allows you to compare like with like, because of course disaster is a very slippery concept. E.L. Quantarelli has famously argued that it's a sponge concept. And so by offering a well-defined understanding of it, I think we can then be able to compare like with like. Okay, now I think one of the most classical definitions of disasters comes to us from Charles Fritz, who famously in the 1960s offered a definition of disasters as an event concentrated in time and space, in which a society or relatively self-sufficient society undergoes severe danger and incurs such losses to its members, so on and so forth. I'm not going to read the entire quote, but I want to focus on that highlighted bit on the slide, that it's concentrated in time and space. Why is that significant? Well, as a number of review works have noted, this definition continues to find resonance in 2016. A number of people have either used this definition wholesale, they've done very little to change it, or they've preserved many aspects of it, including that temporal and spatial qualifier. You can also see this in the work of the anthropological work of David Alexander. He argues that a natural disaster can be defined as some rapid, instantaneous, or profound impact on the natural environment. Another founder in the sociology of disasters, Alan Barton, also has a similar caveat. He talks about how disasters are sudden and violent changes in the physical environment. Now, it is fascinating to note, though, that this doesn't necessarily mean that disasters have only been conceptualized as fast-moving social breakdowns. You can see people studying within the field of sociology of disasters slow-moving phenomena. such as droughts and climate change. But what I would submit to you, though, is that these works have been more marginalized within the discipline, and that's because there really hasn't been a full-throated defense of why disaster should be expanded beyond a very limited temporal category. And beyond the fact that these studies that have focused on slow-moving phenomena, beyond the fact that they've been marginalized, something else I think we should bear in mind is that there have been active defenses against expanding disasters to include other types of temporal phenomena. E.L. Quantarelli is probably most known in this regard. He's argued that we ought to exclude from the concept of disasters all very diffuse events, including traditional droughts and famines, and rather he thinks we should restrict our understanding of disaster to only immediate crises or emergencies. Now, why ought we to maintain a temporally restricted understanding of disaster, according to Quantarelli? He argues that we ought to do so because if you have an overly broad understanding, especially temporally speaking, broad understanding of disasters, you potentially run the risk of capturing too much. The integrity of the concept becomes lost because then anything and everything, according to him, then can be a disaster. It's also not appropriate to include diffuse and gradually occurring phenomena such as droughts and famines as disasters because there are other concepts more fit for purpose, and he specifically uses social and ecological problems as a counterpoint. So he thinks we should regard droughts and famines as social ecological problems rather than disasters, and so that would then allow disasters research to keep a more narrow focus. Now, although there's value in not leaving the definition of disasters too open-ended, I think there's actually some reason to call into question how Quantarelli proposes to do so. Firstly, I think the thing to note is that the distinction between temporally focused and temporally diffuse is actually not very as straightforward as Quantarelli makes it out to be. How fast is fast? How slow is slow? Why would you categorize a tornado as a disaster and perhaps say certain weather moving patterns like an El Nino or certain types of drought? Or where is the line really that we can draw that argues one is fast moving and one isn't? Another reason to question his approach to theorizing disasters is that, simply put, it's not clear that there's a separation between problems and disasters. Social problems can be disasters, and I would submit to you that they can be both fast and slow. It's not clear that disasters and social problems are contrasting concepts as opposed to complementary ones. Right. Now, how then should we perhaps reconceptualize disasters? One option is to adopt a broader definition, which captures how disasters can have transformed over time to include new elements. I'll cite two works in particular, but there have certainly been others. Hans de Smet talks about a whole new ballgame when it comes to disasters, and he argues that it's not just been a quantitative change, there haven't just been more of certain types, but there's been a qualitative shift. And one of those qualitative shifts is that they don't simply respect, they don't simply adhere to traditional understandings of them. And by the way, I should also say Boyne also sort of subscribes to that idea as well. Steve Matthewman has actually further extended this line of thought, and what he focuses on is how disasters research reflects a broader tendency more generally within sociology to focus on events and activities that are spectacular, and that are rapid onset, rather than those that are slow moving and difficult to actually perceive. He then proposes us to understand disasters not as events exclusively, so it's not just a simply temporally bounded entity. He proposes a process-based thinking of disasters, and so he regards things like heat waves as disasters. Even though, so heat waves, according to Quantarelli, would be a social problem. People just deal with it. But he argues that if you think about disasters as being a process, then you might then include a heat wave into it, and that's also because that disasters that are slow moving can actually be a lot more intense and a lot more consequential than fast moving ones, on account that they aren't regarded as disasters as such. Okay. Now, I think it's worthwhile to consider, though, Quantarelli's original point, which is that we do need to have some distinction still in place. So what Matthewman and Desmet don't really consider, though, is why, if you expand the concept of disasters to include slow-moving phenomena, why would you then still want to have some distinctions being made? I think this really ties into some of the insights developed in the sociology of time, which has recently emerged to explore and elaborate how speed matters. Okay? There's been a tremendous amount of work about social acceleration in particular, which refers to the speeding up of social life. And a lot of people have argued that it changes not just the quantitative understanding of social life, but also the qualitative. So speed, in a sense, leads to a number of cascading effects, and so too, might argue, could be the case with various disaster agents. So I think there's a need to preserve the distinction then between rapidly and gradually occurring social disruptions. We can appeal to Alan Barton's classical typology of collective stress situations to help us do this. He defines those collective stress situations that are sudden, gradual, and chronic. So we might then apply this then to our understanding of disasters. So there are those that are very sudden, and these perhaps are ones that we might need to do some research on. But we might also want to look at things that occur very gradually, in the case of heat waves, and you might also include climate change to that. But those that are also chronic, and this moves us away then from more spectacular ways of understanding and researching disasters to ones that are a lot more process-based. Now, actually, before I get to the spatial implications, I will say that there are a number of things that I didn't really address in that very brief discussion of the temporal aspects of disasters. And one of those has to do with the fact that I've been mainly looking at the scholarly understanding of disasters, and not so much the public or the clinical understanding of disasters out in the field. What would be the implications of widening out disasters in those in government policy, in non-academic spheres? It's something I didn't really consider, and I think it's important because of a few reasons. I think some people have argued that oftentimes there is fatigue surrounding the expansion of disaster definitions. So if everything becomes a disaster, well then how much support will that marshal to a particular cause? You know, so if you hear an appeal one week and it's, oh well, this is a disaster, people, we all need to focus on it. And if you widen it out and it becomes a more chronic thing, does that then sort of devalue the potency of calling something a disaster? So that's something. So I'm specifically just focusing on scholarly accounts, but I do realize that there are implications for more public ones. Another thing that I didn't quite cover is what are the methods involved with a more temporally expanded understanding of disasters. One of the key methodological issues with disaster research is that time oftentimes is a critical component and element. So the timeliness of research. And so oftentimes they say that disaster research methods are in some respects similar to the ones that have traditionally been used, but they need to have been adapted. And this is throughout the research process, whether it's the ethics process, analysis process, and certainly the dissemination process as well. So if you look at if it's true, if you accept that disasters can be expanded to slow-moving phenomena as well, then what analytical tools and methodological tools will you need then to grasp those phenomena? I think slow-moving phenomena, according to Ron Pearson, are still very much under-theorized, so we need to rethink how we actually capture and measure their impact. The spatial implications of the theory of disasters that I've been articulating, I think is hopefully pretty self-evident. If you argue that disasters aren't simply disasters aren't simply should be simply temporally restricted, then you perhaps might think that they shouldn't be spatially restricted as well. And in the latter half of my presentation, I kind of wanted to explore that possibility. Now, why we might wish to look at the intersections between disasters and mobilities is because I think the field of disaster research has oftentimes been regarded as quite insular in terms of its theoretical interests. Tierney actually makes a really interesting argument in her 2007 or 2008 article titled "Disasters at a Crossroads," disaster research at a crossroads. And what she said is that it's been inward looking because it's actually been too successful in getting grant funding, which is, by the way, for some of us, that's a great problem to have, right? Obviously. But she says because it's gotten so much grant funding, it hasn't really engaged with some of the broader issues in the discipline. It's done a lot more consultancy work and less traditional analytical academic work. And so there's a need then to bring other disciplinary perspective, to bring it from the margins more into the mainstream. So I think just looking at the intersection between disasters and mobility is one way to do that. And so what I'm going to do now is propose a number of ways in which we can think about disaster mobilities. Okay, so the first intersection between mobility and disasters I'll submit to you is the fact that disasters can be conceptualized as mobility disruptors. This is, I think, a very well-trodden idea, and a number of people, such as Kenneth Ham and of course Monica and Peter Adey, have looked at this concept pretty well, and it's that disaster agents oftentimes destroy or interrupt mobility systems. So September 11th attacks is a really good example, and I won't read out the quote, but the one by Hannum et al. is really good actually. It shows the levels of mobility systems being disrupted, from bridges and tunnels to communication systems to transport systems, and both on the ground and in the air. Scholarly research on the Icelandic volcano has also really looked at this, and as I said, Monica's work, along with Thomas Birchnell and Lucy Budd, have certainly looked at this. What disasters do then, in this aspect of disaster mobilities, which I'm focusing on, is they reshape and reorganize how mobilities and mobilities are structured. Disasters can also be theorized as mobility motivators. As Peter Adey notes, mobility can actually come to constitute the ways that governance responds to emergencies, for example. And that's just one of the ways in which disasters spawn new mobile practices to take place. this is certainly true of governance, as Peter Ady speaks of. By the way, as an aside note, I should say that that article that he published in Mobilities is really instructive about emergency mobilities. But what I would say is there is still a conceptual distinction to be made between disasters and emergencies. And to give you an idea of what's different about disasters and emergencies, I'll first of all look at another difference, conceptual difference between disasters and catastrophes. Oftentimes, these two concepts are thought to be synonymous and they're used interchangeably, just as disasters are also used interchangeably with emergencies and crises. But one difference, and we can clearly see this between disasters and catastrophes, is that disasters typically just refer to various social breakdowns, okay, that usually, but not always, require immediate action of some type. Catastrophes actually refer to incidences, social breakdowns, that actually prevent various forms of recovery from taking place. So it's not in other words, the catastrophe could be argued as a subset of within the definition of disasters, and that's because when a catastrophe happens, the recovery systems within a various society are actually also affected. Actually, Quantarelli makes this point. I think it's a very persuasive one. So that gives us a bit of conceptual precision to distinguish between disasters and catastrophes. Same with emergencies and disasters. I think emergencies refer to breakdowns or disruptions involving immediate action or decision. I would submit to you that disasters don't necessarily always fit that. And the reason for that has to do with the fact that, as I said, disasters aren't just simply fast-moving, they could be slow-moving as well. So you can define a number of things as disasters, such as droughts, climate change. Antimicrobial resistance has also been regarded as a slow-moving disaster. But they do not necessarily involve immediate action. You could argue that they involve actually sustained action. Anyways, that's an aside. But 80, going back to disasters and mobility motivators, he certainly notes a number of ways in which disasters governance involves the production of new mobile practices. In that they can, but disasters doesn't just simply work in terms of, it doesn't simply exist at the level of motivating governance to take place. It can also prompt people or force people to move. So people can become displaced, according to the work of Scheller, or people can move because they anticipate some type of event taking place. So it need not necessarily affect them in the material. I guess it's still material if you anticipate it, but in the immediate sense, it can also perhaps affect them in the imaginative sense. Movement doesn't, as a result of disasters, doesn't necessarily need to be elective. I think this is an area of research that hasn't really been explored too much so far. I could be wrong about this, but in that disasters could also prompt people to move, but for more elective ones. I think tornado chasing, going to disaster zones is a good example of this. It could also be disaster-motivated mobilities may also be virtual. So when disasters occur, people may also use social medias in various ways. I think the fact that Facebook has that check-in option, I don't know enough about this, maybe Monica, you might, but do people use social media more during times of crises, disasters? And do they also use them in do they not use them more, do they use them in different ways? And so these are some of the ways in which disasters might be considered as mobility motivators. A third facet of disaster mobilities concerns the deployment of disasters as indicators of various mobility systems. So it doesn't just motivate, it doesn't simply destroy, it can also indicate various ways in which mobilities are at the heart of various social systems. Hurricane Katrina and the Icelandic volcano eruption are really relevant when trying to express this particular point. Show how there are tremendous amounts of inequalities, in various related to various forms of movement. If you can look at this through many different lenses. Scheller has looked at how mobility is affected. Various types of mobilities are affected through the prism of the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. She's specifically looked at the concept of mobility justice to understand how various blockages or paradoxically various forced movements helped us to understand which groups are socially advantaged or disadvantaged. But I think Cook and I'm not sure how to pronounce this. I want to say Buttes, but it might just be Butts. So I'm going to use Butts because that's the level I operate at. But Cook and Butts, they've actually, I think, taken this even further and looking at a disaster in Pakistan and looked at how disasters often have cascading set of inequalities on account of their effects on mobility. So it's not just simply that people are blocked from moving or that their infrastructure is blocked. This actually has all these various other effects that stem from this, these effects on mobility. So they talked about how disasters can lead to social isolation, various types of employment, food insecurity, various distressed emotional states, and so on and so forth. And that they think, and what's interesting about their discussion of mobility justice, which contrasts with the one put forth by Scheller, is that they're much more focused on institutional practices around mobility and disasters. So they appeal to Iris Marion Young's concept of domination, which is more broadly found with her theory of social justice, to help articulate this particular point. For them, domination helps to realize that it's not simply the fact that mobility is governed by various social relations. There are institutional factors that help to propel people's, I guess, distribution of justice in certain ways. We can also think of disasters as consequences of mobilities. And what I'm referring to here is the fact that there might be mobile systems that might cause disasters to happen more or less frequently. Climate change, if you take my understanding of disasters in the previous part of my presentation, I think is a really good example. So a contributor to climate change, of course, is the dominant mode of automobility, which we find in many parts of the world. And so mobilities actually might be either the precondition or indeed the very cause of various disasters. And I guess the other thing I should just quickly mention is that when it comes to climate change, it's actually, you can see how it operates on many different levels. Climate change is both, I would argue, a disaster unto itself, but it also involves the increase in frequencies of certain other types of more sudden disasters. So it itself occurs over a longer period of time than perhaps many disasters researchers are comfortable with. But it also involves the transformation or the shift in how more rapidly onset disasters, how they are expressed and how they're felt. So when we think about slow-moving disasters, we're not actually simply just looking at things that take over a certain period of time and that there's no sudden component involved. I think that the relationship between slow-moving disasters and fast-moving disasters is actually a lot more complex than perhaps people have given the distinction credit for. All right. And then finally, I want to kind of end by talking about how disaster agents can be mobile in themselves. Disaster agents, both in terms of its cause, its formation. So some disasters might form because of far and away events, okay? Or paradoxically, you might also see, or not paradoxically, but contrastingly, you could also understand how disasters themselves might just travel. I think antimicrobial resistance, so resistance to various antibodies, that might be something that travels around the world. Or you might also think of disasters like SARS. But of course, each time these things travel, it's obviously still very context dependent. And so that's why I've included this little thing about still maintaining a global quality. All right, and then I just kind of want to conclude by just some of the methodological implications of what I've talked about. How does, what new concepts and or methods need to be sort of pioneered, transformed to capture disaster mobilities? And in particular, I want to focus on the role of the researcher. And this is just from a very practical point of view, when you hear people entering into disaster zones to do research, it's also sometimes regarded as very difficult on a practical level. Much less just the ethics application, the need to get funding, insurance, all that other stuff. But what I'm curious about is how then would you do research if these things are on the move? What type of collaborations might you need? What new tools, I guess research tools, and maybe I'd be interested to hear a lot about that, because obviously there's a lot of experience here. And those are just some of the preliminary thoughts I have about how disasters and mobilities might intersect. And I think that's really it. I've come to the end of my presentation, so thanks very much for your attention. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Eric. We've got time for discussion. We can keep it quite informal, I think. Just do you have any questions, comments, suggestions?
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. I just wonder whether one of the kind of elements that you might want to add to your theoretical framework might be an account of the political construction of disasters. Within science and technology studies, there's been quite a lot of work in thinking about how controversies arise and how they attract publics. And in some ways, when it comes to slow-moving disasters, that's a very relevant question. So you talk for instance about climate change, which has succeeded, despite not being entirely successful, has succeeded in attracting or becoming a controversial issue and attracting a public. And that might be due to various mobility systems. If you look, for instance, at road deaths,
Sure, yeah.
then that isn't something that really has attracted much of a public. So if you really want to, in this kind of matrix, you really need an account of why something becomes conceptualized as politically problematic and how it attracts a public as as an interested set of actors.
It's a very good point. I think if you really think about it, it's not simply just that I'm looking at things like I'm considering looking at things like climate change and droughts and heat waves, but you potentially could regard increasing rates of suicide as a disaster, right? But then people not necessarily considering it such, and they're not marching.
They might in some context. For instance, in Switzerland, suicide became a big, actually referendum about gun control about suicide, because it was the high rate of gun ownership in Switzerland was seen as actually causing a kind of epidemic of suicide. So you need to look empirically at why in certain situations, and then that question becomes.
And I guess the other point about this is, if you follow the line put forth by Kroll, Smith, and Benton, is it Brenton? One of them. Do you take a real cultural understanding of it? And a disaster is not defined by any real set of categories. It's just what people say it is, right? think there's a number of problems with that analytically, and that's why I try not to wade into the public debate side of things, right? So I don't want to say that my definition of disasters should necessarily be adopted by practitioners and those in the field, and by the broader public. I'm just trying to think, because I think it is important to try, when you're doing either comparative research, to be able to compare like with like, you know. So but some people might consider, you know, you know, if you drop a burrito on the ground, a disaster, right? And then someone might compare that with a very serious, you know, tsunami that occurs. And that's a very flippant sort of comparison, but nevertheless, that kind of shows you that some amount of consensus might be needed then to be able to adequately compare. So, but I take your point though about the controversies and trying to understand, well, what becomes actually considered a problem and a serious problem to elevate it to a disaster level.
Actually,
Do I just-
I just wanted to, I had a thought that relates to it, which was just how I think time actually might be something of it. I mean, I love love the idea of blowing up time in disasters, for the lack of a better way to put it, no pun intended. Because I think that there's a lot of work that's hinted about how different time scales actually changes even what recovery means,
Sure, yeah,
and how you see that. And so that leads to a few different thoughts about which political frame then is appropriate to consider within that. And that just leads me to two thoughts that I just wanted to throw out there. I don't know what to do with them exactly. But ages ago, I read a critique of Lefebvre of Du Bourg, which might seem like it has nothing to do with it, but it was about the spectacle. And it's Lefebvre thinking about space and time as this not geographical, starting to work through some of these ideas that he was working on. And said the only reason why a spectacle can exist is because time is removed. And so thinking about disaster tourism and things like that and these other forms of disaster as spectacle, disaster as having a political public because it's a spectacle. There might be something there because time has a different relationship to that than to these slow moving. And that leads me to wondering then, what is comparable? How do you define the comparable then? Because even Tierney herself says you can't necessarily compare lessons from one disaster to the next. And that leads to false assumptions and disaster myths. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think time's a great place to start looking at that. The other thing that then makes me ask is, if catastrophe is different from disaster because it has a different type of recovery, or doesn't allow certain types of recovery, then is Chernobyl a catastrophe, not a disaster? Because, you know, or how do you know when you've reached that recovery, or what that is then? And if it depends on how you look at time. So.
I'll pick
Sorry,
up
those are
that's great questions. And when it comes to recovery, I've probably thought about this less than you have, perhaps. Because I said this is a very new field for me. I'm much more interested in sleeping. Which, by the way, makes it fantastic anytime I'm lecturing, because if students fall asleep, which invariably they will, it's not such a bad thing, is it? Because it's an interesting cultural practice. Anyways, but when it comes to recovery, I would just say, I think researchers in the field of disaster research have long acknowledged that disasters have they have effects that stretch into time, right? So I think none of them ever said that, you know, an earthquake couldn't then be socially felt for decades to come, maybe hundreds of years to come, really. But they've excluded, but they would say, they would still submit to you that disaster agent happened really, really quickly. Okay, and that's what made it a disaster.
Yeah.
So in terms of the recovery, they've always, I think, accepted that it's okay for things to happen really, that recovery could take a long time, but that the precipitating event was very shortly lived. But I would say, so what I'm trying to do is actually focus on the cause of disaster agent and its formation, and saying that actually these things can occur for a lot longer than we normally expect. Okay, and so like, I think a great example is heat waves. Like, a heat wave can take very long periods to actually make itself manifest. And in fact, you could argue that when it comes to certain crops, that it might take decades sometimes to make its impact actually felt. And obviously then you'd have to distinguish between an effect and the actual event itself. And so that's why I think Matthew Min is interesting in that he's trying to move away from an events-based understanding of disasters to a more process-based one. And so that a disaster is something that's kind of always unfolding, and you can't simply just say, all right, this is what a disaster is, and this is what has been. In terms of your other question, which I think was about the, remind me again, it was about the,
More just a thought out loud.
One thing that did occur to me actually when you were, was that I think disasters research, when it comes to the comparability of disasters, I think that's a really interesting point, and obviously it hits at the point of what is, I think, really sociology in some respects. Can you treat it as a laboratory? I mean, but that being said, you know, and maybe this has to do with social futures as well, because you're both there is a predictive element then to disasters research, right? So you're saying this is what happened previously, and this is how we understand it. This is likely to occur in the future, and this is the lessons learned. So I think you're right. There is some incommensurability with every single disaster, although there are some disasters I would submit to you that are recurrent and that they're structural. So actually, Miya Matsumoto, a sociologist out in Tokyo, he's written about the structural disaster. And he argues that Fukushima occurred because there's been a culture of secrecy dating back all the way before the Second World War during the Imperial Japanese rule. And that culture of secrecy then also led to the prevention, also led to the unwillingness of the Japanese government to release details about the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And he argues that this is just one in a number of recurrent disasters in Japan, and that this is actually structurally based. But going back, it's the incommensurability. I think it's showing how things can be different but still the same. I'm not sure if that's a great answer. I was kind of just rambling a bit, but those are just some of the thoughts.
Yeah, Maggie, and then I don't know your name.
Yeah.
And then me.
Well, once you mention Fukushima, I think we have to think about Charles Perrow and the kind of analysis which talks about the tight coupling of systems and that those embody disasters out of space and time. So from science and technology studies, that's a very strong theme. But just a comment about the notion of event,
Okay.
which I think you've started to say is deeply problematic. And the notion of event in itself. I mean, in all my kind of empirical engagements with disasters or what gets called the aftermath of disasters, I don't think I've ever encountered an engagement with individuals or communities that hasn't referred to events before the event, or memory of, or I told them this was going to happen, or look at that, you can see the antecedents of what gets called the event is such a big part of what local people or people who've experienced disaster talk about as disaster, the unfolding story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'm not sure if this is too simplistic or naive understanding of how disasters have been defined, especially by some of the I guess I would call it the American school, some of the old guard. But it seems like disasters happen, they're sudden, they're surprising, they're very, very novel, they're unexpected. And then people, I never would have thought this would have occurred. And then that leads on to various effects. But of course, as you said, there's a number of antecedents, and also.
But indeed, the old guard includes people like Erickson, whose kind of main point was the unfolding nature. The disaster has already happened.
Sure.
You know, it's a kind of a major theme in his work.
Well, and I think the idea of maybe vulnerabilities and that shift to looking at
Indeed.
that is also very useful. Because then vulnerabilities isn't simply like, oh, you're only vulnerable at that very exact point when an earthquake hits. It's exposing perhaps a larger ongoing, I guess, set of relations that we may be aware of. And it's very actually curious. I remember when I read that Tierney piece, I think many of you might be familiar with, I was struck by just even basic things like, so this turn of vulnerability is really instructive, and part of that has to do with the fact that it's pushing disaster research to engage more with key sociological ideas such as gender. And that kind of surprised me a little bit, because when she wrote it in 2007, the fact that you have to say, oh, this is great, we're engaging more with gender now in a particular field, is kind of odd, if that makes any sense. You take it as a given, so many different fields of study, but for that comment to have been made and to actually have some purchase, perhaps that's maybe overstated, is just a bit surprising. And I think that has to do with the perhaps conceptual frameworks in which they've been using. But I take your point, I think that's a really interesting thing to pursue.
Sorry, I speak probably more as a practitioner than as I'm learning to be academic, so I started my PhD, but I come from an emergency management background.
Okay.
And you were asking about social media use in emergencies, and it definitely does go up, and there's lots of practical work. I'm not sure about the academic side of things, but there's a lot of apps and tools that you can design that push messages out for during emergencies, and that can potentially influence their movement away to or from an incident. But in particular, there was an app designed for if you have large events like the Lord Mayor's show, that you can download an app that tells you about which boats are going past, but if they had a terrorist incident or some kind of incident during that, they could push out messages. And certainly around the sharing economy, lots of things like Facebook and Airbnb, they all have black sites that they can then set up to then assist during emergencies. So Airbnb, you could potentially register your flat and say, I don't want you to pay me for my flat, but anybody who's had to evacuate or responders coming to the area, you could start using that. The other thing I wanted to say was around definitions of recovery. Having worked with lots of people, there are so many differences around what people deem to be recovery around in nuclear installations. We speak to the practitioners actually working there, they very much deem it to be like, I've got my bit of plant safe and it's stopped potentially emitting what it shouldn't be. Whereas from an emergency management perspective, we might look at the longer term, but actually what do you recover to? And we start to look at it around recovering to a sort of new normality, because it might never get back to what it was before. And I don't know that you can necessarily, if you're never recovering back to what you were before the incident, you can never sort of you can never put a time that we've got back there now. So it's actually very difficult to define how long that time means. And then I was also, sorry, I've been saying, I've been noting things that I was like, oh, that's probably relevant, around the time for disasters to manifest themselves, particularly around, say, technical disasters and incidents. If you look at things like the Swiss cheese model for things going wrong, it means like there are unfathomable ways that incidents can occur, and you can't predict all of them. And you sort of put in defences to try and stop them from occurring, and various safety mechanisms. But actually, the ones that do get through are generally because you could say that they're because there's a hole in each of those, and that particular bit is thought through, so there's a hole through all of them. And you mentioned about lessons learned, and definitely from a practitioner hat, we have a massive bugbear about the term lessons learned, and that people hopefully should use lessons identified, because a lot of things come up that get identified all the time, and actually the changes that are needed to make them learned or to demonstrate that you've actually learned them is a completely different kettle of fish.
Listen, I think that's all really, you raise all great points.
Sorry, there weren't any questions.
No. I think in particular, the idea of normality is a really interesting one. You get the sense that when some of the early disaster definitions were laid out in the 1960s, it's very functionalist and very Parsonian. You know, that there's a normal way in which society operated, and then once stuff's deviated, then it was all about trying to get back to the norm. So I think it perhaps raises broader questions around that, and is there such a thing as a normal society? I think it's really difficult to tell. Or what's normal within a society, perhaps, or within a context or within a particular milieu. There's a lot, certainly more, I think, that can be done, and of course I think the interface between practitioners and academics is a very important one. And the reason I avoided it is actually just because I think there are people that are a lot smarter than I am that will probably be able to do that, because I think it involves a number of different tools you'll need. So you not only need to know what's within practitioners, what's the ways of thinking about an issue, but I also think, you know, what are the broader impacts on a policy level, on a cultural level, in defining these things. And I just didn't want to go down that path, but it might be certainly one to explore. And yeah, it's all, and also the social media stuff that you raise. I think actually Monica might have actually a lot to say about that. Stuff that the research that you did on collective intelligence, is that right? I thought it was really interesting because certainly how disasters are experienced and the things that they involve, the practices they involve, perhaps might be shifting. And I think social media might be a really interesting one, but maybe beyond social media as well. I think there's a lot to be done there, but maybe it's already been done. I don't know. As I said, I'm very new to this field, and it's sort of a side project I'm involved in. And just lastly, this is just a plug. The conference that Monica did mention that we're running next year at the Hawke Institute is we can still accept a few abstracts, even though you'll see the closing date. So if you are interested, we'd very be glad to host you. And of course, what Monica didn't mention is, of course, that she is one of the keynotes for this particular conference, and so we'll be very pleased to have her there. So, yes.
I've got a question as well.
Yes.
There's a chair there.
Oh, sure.
You might
right, sure.
I'm not going to make you stand for 2
That's
hours. Maybe I can address a bit of the crisis informatics stuff around the question. The question is, well, I've got a ton of questions, but they all kind of circle around this one, which is what new analytical leverage do we gain by taking a mobilities analytical orientation to disasters? So I heard you in a way arguing that actually we can think of disasters as a mobility system.
Mm-hmm.
So then I started thinking, well, can we think of normality as a mobility system, or gender as a mobility system, or the capitalism or secrets offshoring? And what does that allow us to do that we can't do with actor network theory or normal accident theory?
Sure.
And one thing that, and I'd like to hear what you've got to say, but one thing that I thought becomes possible with a mobilities perspective, because it's very good at being multiscalar, and at looking at the distributed and the fleeting and the connected, is to think of the constellations of all these different types of mobilities that you were talking about, which makes you then see the network, but in motion in a way. And whereas actor network theory kind of allows you to trace it retrospectively, a mobilities perspective in some ways allows you to go along with it a bit more. And I know that in analysis of how social media are being used in response to crisis, that people are watching how people are bootstrapping infrastructures. They use Skype and Google Hangouts and Twitter and how they plug them together to self-organize a response, which kind of transforms the responsibilities for the response, gets shows how people are actually helping themselves, and then opens up friction points with the formal response. So I think you might be onto something there if you develop mobile methods to follow it as it unfolds with more sensitivity, then